What if I told you that the moment they touched your body, it had nothing to do with love and everything to do with control? This isn't a love story, it's a psychological battlefield, and your heart was the first casualty. We're not here to cry over broken promises or spilled affection. We're here to expose the uncomfortable truth. Intimacy, when weaponized, becomes a silent war of power. It begins with soft whispers and ends in silent submission, and most don't even realize they've been conquered. Ever wonder why you felt smaller afterward, even when you thought you had won them over? That wasn't passion, it was possession. And here's the twist. The ones who dominate in the dark often wear the mask of affection in daylight. By the end of this, you'll not only understand why they did it, but you'll never be deceived by that illusion again. But be warned, once you see it, you can't unsee it. Ready to wake up? 2. Intimacy is often portrayed as the most sacred expression of love, a moment where vulnerability meets trust and two souls dissolve into one another. But beneath this romanticized ideal lies a darker psychological reality that very few are willing to confront. Intimacy can also be weaponized. It can be a calculated performance, not an act of affection. When used as a tool of psychological control, intimacy transforms from something sacred into something strategic. The touch feels warm, the gaze seems tender, but underneath it all lies an unspoken agenda. The goal isn't connection, it's domination masked in closeness. It's about getting inside your mind before your body, about controlling your emotional responses without you ever suspecting foul play. It begins subtly. You may feel drawn to someone who appears attentive, emotionally available, and even nurturing. You confuse their intensity with depth, their obsession with care, but slowly you begin to notice how your choices shrink while their presence expands. You think it's love growing when in fact it's your boundaries fading. The intimacy is persistent and soon you're emotionally dependent, seeking validation, craving their attention, needing their approval just to feel secure in your own skin. And that's the trap. When intimacy is used for control, it never appears violent. It appears necessary. You're made to believe you're lucky to have someone so close, so passionate, so involved. But in truth, you're being psychologically enclosed, gradually disconnected from your own autonomy. Those who use intimacy as a control tactic are often masters of emotional disguise. They read your needs and mirror them, reflect your desires, and offer themselves as the perfect emotional antidote to your past wounds. They listen, not out of empathy, but to map your vulnerabilities. They memorize your traumas, not to soothe them, but to use them as pressure points when you resist their influence. At first, they seem like a dream, an answer to your longing. Over time, they become a maze you can't escape. You begin to question your own thoughts, distrust your instincts, and rely more heavily on their interpretation of reality than your own. It doesn't feel like imprisonment. It feels like a deepening bond. That's the brilliance of psychological control through intimacy. It enslaves while making you feel cherished. This kind of control is especially dangerous because it doesn't rely on physical force or open threats. It's not about bruises or broken doors. It's about whispered justifications and emotional entanglement. It's about a kind of intimacy that makes you feel simultaneously seen and invisible, desired yet dismissed. They'll draw you in with moments of genuine connection, only to subtly shift the dynamic so that your worth becomes tethered to their mood. If they're pleased, you feel loved. If they're cold, you spiral. Over time, your emotional weather becomes dictated by someone else's internal climate. And what's most chilling is how normal it begins to feel. There's a cruel paradox at play here. The very moments that should offer the most safety, physical closeness, emotional sharing, vulnerability, become mechanisms of control. You begin to fear the withdrawal of intimacy more than you fear the manipulation itself. You compromise, you justify, you silence your own discomfort because the thought of losing that closeness feels unbearable. The intimacy that once felt healing now feels addictive. You're no longer choosing it freely, you're clinging to it because they've made you believe it's the only place where you're worthy. This kind of psychological domination often leaves no trace, no evidence, nothing you can point to and say, here is the harm. Yet the damage is profound. You lose your sense of self. Your ability to trust your inner voice deteriorates. You start accommodating behavior that would once have been intolerable, all under the illusion of intimacy. It's not that the affection wasn't real, it's that it was conditional, transactional, and used as a currency to buy your submission. You weren't loved for who you are. You were molded into who they needed you to be to maintain control. The human longing for closeness is powerful, and those who understand this can exploit it effortlessly. They know that if they can make you feel deeply seen, heard, and desired, they can guide your decisions without ever having to demand compliance. You will follow them, not because they force you, but because they've made you believe it's your own choice. You will stay, not because the relationship is healthy, but because the intimacy feels irreplaceable. And therein lies the cruel genius of psychological control through intimacy. It steals your freedom while making you feel adored. Dominance is rarely loud at first. It does not kick down the door. It doesn't wear the face of cruelty from the start. Instead, it slips in quietly, often dressed in affection. It smiles warmly, remembers your favorite songs, compliments the small things about you no one else notices. It seems kind. It seems gentle. It wraps itself in charm, in consideration, in perfect timing. It watches you closely, not to admire you, but to assess where your walls are softest. Dominance, when it seeks longevity, doesn't strike. It seduces, and in its most calculated form, it uses love as a costume and affection as its favorite weapon. You feel held, but you're being studied. You feel wanted, but you're being sized up for control. The cleverness lies in how affection lowers your guard. In the beginning, you're not suspicious. You're flattered. Someone who listens deeply, touches with tenderness, makes you feel like the most important person in the room. What's not to trust? They pay attention to details, speak your love language fluently, and echo your emotions like they were their own. You interpret this as connection. But often, what you're experiencing is emotional reconnaissance. They are learning the precise buttons to push, the exact words to say, and the delicate fears that make you pliable. They don't need to use force when they can use familiarity. They don't need to raise their voice when they can simply raise your hopes. By the time dominance reveals itself, it doesn't look like a red flag. It looks like love asking for sacrifice. They don't demand power outright. They make you offer it willingly. Little compromises at first. Change your schedule to fit theirs. Stop talking to that friend who always judges us. Adjust your tone because it makes me feel disrespected. These requests come wrapped in emotional appeals, delivered with soft voices and wounded eyes. You bend, not because you're weak, but because you care. You want to preserve the affection, to keep the connection. But with each bend, something within you reshapes. You start to filter yourself, silence instincts, question your boundaries. You become emotionally obedient, all in the name of love. And that's how dominance thrives, not through threat, but through emotional transaction. It's not just romantic relationships where this shows up. Dominance masquerading as affection can happen with parents, friends, even mentors. I only want what's best for you, they say, while directing every decision. You know how much I care, they remind you, while dismissing your needs. The more affection they express, the more guilty you feel for questioning them. You start to confuse their approval with your worth, and that confusion becomes a leash. This type of affection feels warm, but it burns slowly. It conditions you to equate control with care, silence with peace, and submission with love. And by the time you begin to feel the pressure, your mind has already rewritten the script. This isn't control, it's just how love works. The danger lies in how this conditioning reshapes your perception. Dominance that uses affection as a shield doesn't need to punish you, it just withdraws. A cold shoulder here, a dismissive silence there. And because they've trained you to depend on their warmth, their emotional distance feels like a death sentence. You begin to police your behavior, walking on invisible glass, just to avoid that dreaded feeling of being unloved. They don't have to correct you anymore, you've started correcting yourself. That's the point where dominance becomes invisible. It no longer operates externally, it lives inside your choices, your compromises, your silence. You begin to betray yourself to stay close to someone who only appears gentle. What makes this even more painful is that sometimes the affection is real. People who dominate others are not always aware of their tactics. Some genuinely believe they love deeply. But love without respect, without freedom, without equality, is just neediness dressed up as romance. Dominance doesn't always come from malice. Sometimes it comes from fear. The fear of losing control, of being vulnerable, of letting someone be their full self without interference. But regardless of intention, the impact remains. One person is shrinking while the other expands. One gives up their autonomy while the other collects emotional obedience under the pretense of intimacy. There's also the psychological trap of confusion. How can someone who holds you so tenderly also be the source of your emotional suffocation? You doubt yourself. You minimize your intuition. You gaslight your own heart because it feels easier than confronting the possibility that the person who seems to love you is actually dominating you. That cognitive dissonance is exactly what keeps the cycle alive. Dominance flourishes in environments where clarity is clouded by comfort, where pain is coated in passion, where affection is used not to nourish, but to own. You don't realize you're being dominated until it's too late, until the affection you once craved now controls you, until love begins to feel like obligation, until every decision requires mental permission from someone else's invisible standards. And when you finally start to wake up, to pull away, the affection will spike. They'll call you by your favorite name. They'll remember the version of themselves that made you fall. But now you know, affection that must be earned through obedience isn't love, it's a strategy, and dominance will always wear the softest smile when it wants to own you without resistance. Sexual power plays are rarely recognized for what they are in the moment. They masquerade as passion, as chemistry, as irresistible connection. The intensity feels intoxicating, the desire overwhelming, and the aftermath confusing. But hidden within these encounters is a quieter consequence. They leave wounds so subtle, so internal, that they escape language. These wounds don't bleed, they don't bruise visibly, yet they dismantle who you are in ways that feel irreversible. What makes them so dangerous is that they often feel like love. The attention, the seduction, the whispered praise, they create an illusion of closeness. But what's really happening is something far more sinister. The systematic erosion of your identity beneath the disguise of intimacy. It starts with the way they look at you, as though you're the center of their universe. It feels empowering, even sacred. You feel chosen, seen, desired. But slowly, your sense of self begins to shift. You start dressing the way they like, moving the way they find attractive, speaking the way that draws their attention. These changes don't seem threatening. In fact, they feel thrilling. You think you're growing closer, building something magnetic. But what's really happening is that you're morphing. Not because they asked you to outright, but because their approval becomes the currency of your self-worth. And the more they respond to who you become for them, the more detached you grow from who you were before them. Sexual power games thrive in unspoken hierarchies. One person sets the tone, the rules, the rhythm. The other adapts, sometimes willingly, other times unconsciously. You may feel like you're in control because you say yes, because you feel the thrill too. But consent given under emotional dependency isn't true consent, it's performance disguised as freedom. You aren't surrendering out of trust, you're surrendering to avoid rejection. And that's the first fracture. You convince yourself this is what intimacy is supposed to feel like, electric, wild, overwhelming. But in truth, you're learning to find validation in your own disappearance. You're mistaking being desired for being loved, and those are not the same. Over time, your inner voice softens to a whisper. You stop checking in with your discomfort. You silence the questions in your mind that ask, is this really what I want? Because asking them feels like betrayal. Not betrayal of them, but of the fantasy you've become addicted to, that this is love, that this is connection, that this is the one. And this is how sexual power play buries itself deep into your psyche. It creates pleasure laced with confusion, arousal fused with dependency. You may feel flattered by how much they want you, how urgently they reach for you, but somewhere deep inside, a quiet terror begins to grow. Because you realize that if you ever stop performing the version of yourself they want, the attention might disappear. These kinds of wounds don't announce themselves. They slip into your sense of identity, your ability to say no, your trust in your own feelings. You become fluent in self-betrayal, mastering the art of smiling while your soul contracts. You laugh at their jokes even when they sting. You let them cross your boundaries and then convince yourself you're just being open-minded. You absorb their criticism as truth, their silence as punishment, their compliments as oxygen, and in doing so, you become tethered, not by chains, but by the longing to stay desired. The worst part is that the world often applauds this dynamic. You're told to feel lucky that someone finds you so irresistible. Friends admire the chemistry, culture romanticizes the chase, the tension, the domination masked as seduction, but no one sees the price you're paying. That beneath the surface-level empowerment lies depletion. That behind every night of feeling consumed is a morning of feeling hollow. These wounds aren't loud. They echo in the quiet moments, in the way you hesitate to voice your needs, in the way you flinch at emotional intimacy that isn't sexual. They echo in how you see yourself, through the eyes of someone who never truly saw you at all. Eventually, your reflection begins to blur. You can't remember what your desires were before them, what made you feel safe, what turned you on in a way that didn't require performing. You lose access to your own erotic self, the part of you that belonged only to you. And even when the relationship ends, the echo of their dominance remains. It follows you into new relationships, into how you interpret touch, into how you gauge worth. You second-guess affection. You question genuine interest. You brace for manipulation even when it isn't present, because your body still remembers what it felt like to be wanted without being valued. Healing from these invisible wounds requires more than distance. It demands excavation. You must peel back the layers of performance you wore like armor. You must relearn how to feel without filtering it through someone else's approval. You must reclaim your sensuality not as a tool for attention, but as an expression of your truth. The pain of this process is real because what was stolen wasn't just love. It was access to your own identity, your own voice, your own body. And the tragedy is, you gave it away, thinking you were being loved in return. Seductive manipulation does not arrive with warnings. It does not shout or announce itself. It whispers in sweet tones, makes eye contact that feels like safety, and holds you just tightly enough to confuse control with care. It flatters your wounds, strokes your insecurities, and presents itself as exactly what you thought you needed. And that's what makes it so powerful. It doesn't violate you with force, it disarms you with familiarity. You don't run from it. You lean in. You feel chosen, cherished, even elevated. But what's happening beneath the surface is not love or connection, it's conditioning. And by the time you recognize the pattern, it has already started to shape your perception, your decisions, your beliefs about your own worth. That's why awareness becomes not just helpful, but essential. It is the only antidote to manipulation that hides behind seduction. Most people trapped in cycles of manipulation don't realize they're being manipulated until the damage is already internalized, because the manipulator doesn't present as dangerous. They present as perfect. They mirror your desires, reflect your pain, and slowly become the answer to every question you didn't know you were asking. They offer relief from loneliness, from doubt, from rejection. They study your emotional blueprint and then wrap themselves around your psyche like a warm blanket. But the warmth is conditional. The affection is strategic. And the safety you feel isn't rooted in truth. It's designed to make you dependent. Every word, every glance, every touch is part of a larger mechanism meant to keep you emotionally pliable and energetically small. This kind of manipulation is seductive precisely because it makes you feel powerful while you are being made powerless. You believe you have control, that you are choosing the connection, that you are seen and valued. But your choices are gradually shaped by fear. Fear of losing their affection, fear of upsetting their balance, fear of abandonment. You begin to censor yourself, not because they demand it, but because your emotional survival depends on their approval. This is how manipulation becomes self-sustaining. You participate in your own silencing because the alternative, being unloved, unseen, rejected, feels too devastating to risk. Awareness shatters this illusion. It pulls back the curtain. It shows you the strings behind the theater. But awareness doesn't come comfortably. It often arrives as a whisper of unease, a moment of contradiction, a flash of clarity in the middle of emotional chaos. At first you resist it. You rationalize, minimize, defend. You tell yourself they didn't mean it. You remind yourself of the good times. You hold on to the version of them that existed before the mask slipped. But eventually, the truth becomes too heavy to ignore. You realize that the love you thought you had was built on conditions, that your identity has slowly been traded for validation, and that the cost of staying asleep is far greater than the pain of waking up. True awareness is not just about seeing the manipulator for who they are. It's about seeing yourself clearly for the first time in a long time. You begin to recognize the ways you abandoned your own voice to keep the peace. You notice how often you prioritize their comfort over your boundaries. You remember the moments you said yes when your entire body screamed no, and this recognition, while painful, is also liberating, because once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. The spell breaks. The grip loosens. You stop mistaking intensity for intimacy, control for care, dominance for love. Awareness doesn't erase the pain, but it gives it meaning. It transforms confusion into clarity and regret into responsibility. You stop asking, "Why did they do this to me?" and start asking, "What did I ignore in myself to allow this?" That question is the gateway to healing. It brings the focus back to your own agency. Because the truth is, manipulators exist in every corner of life. They will continue to seduce, to flatter, to charm. But once you are aware, you become immune to their strategies. Not because they stop trying, but because you no longer need their approval to feel whole. This awareness must become embodied. It's not enough to intellectually understand manipulation. You must feel the shifts in your body when someone pushes past your boundaries with a smile. You must learn to trust the discomfort that arises when someone's words say one thing but their energy says another. You must teach yourself to pause before responding, to reflect before reacting, to anchor yourself before surrendering. These are the skills that awareness births. They make you resilient, not by hardening you, but by sharpening your perception. And perhaps the greatest gift of awareness is that it reconnects you to your intuition, the part of you that always knew. The part that sensed something was off even when your mind was filled with excuses. Intuition and awareness are twin flames in the fire of liberation. Together, they lead you back to yourself. And from that place, no seduction can manipulate you. No charm can ensnare you, because you no longer seek outside of yourself what only your truth can provide.